Alrighty, sounds like we're going to move towards getting started. So thanks everyone so much for being here. Appreciate the time and attendance. Welcome to the talk, Adversary TTP Evolution and the Value of TTP Intelligence. Going to be walking through this recent and growing trend of adversary TTP evolution and then try to kind of introduce this relatively new concept of TTP intelligence. Just some real quick background about myself. I don't have a who am I slide, so I'm Scott Small. I'm currently Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence at Tidal Cyber. We provide software solutions trying to help organizations implement threat-informed defense. I've spent my entire career in intelligence research and analysis, only about half of which has been in the cyberspace specifically, but it's all been really around trying to quantify threats, which can be a very challenging topic, and that's really where the topic here today is kind of derived from. I don't have them posted yet, but I will be sharing the slides, so folks don't have to worry about taking super detailed notes. Feel free to reach out just to make sure you get them afterwards. Real quick agenda for today. Definitely want to highlight I'm very open to taking questions as we go along. So if you don't mind, just raise your hand, shout it out. Anything works. It'll help me kind of break things up and save my voice a little bit as well. But here's what we'll be walking through. Before we even get to the topic of TTP evolution, we're actually going to spend quite a while kind of level setting, talking about what are TTPs in general, so we can all be speaking a common language. I know everyone might be coming in with different exposures and experience levels, so I usually get more positive feedback than anything when we take that moment to take a step back. But then we'll be getting into kind of the main point of today's talk, which is walking through some specific, very recent examples where we've seen major adversaries evolving their TTPs, oftentimes in very quick fashion, and talk about what are some of the actual drivers behind that. And then finally, hopefully, what folks are ultimately here for, some defensive takeaways. So really, how can we use intelligence to help us improve addressing TTP evolution, as well as I'll talk just a bit about some specific mitigations and detection guidance as well. But I want to begin, again, by taking this step back so we can all be talking a similar language. We're definitely seeing a shift, oftentimes kind of born out of necessity, but also trying to take different approaches to defense. And this is kind of my corny way of framing this all up. So totally transforming defensive priorities, or TTPs. So let's just talk about what are TTPs ultimately. The quick, simple definition that I'm using for today's presentation, it's tactics, techniques, and procedures. One word that I'm going to use, it's a little bit less formal, but for the purposes of a talk like today, I'm going to use them pretty much interchangeably. It's adversary behaviors. And what this behaviors terminology is really doing, we can start to contrast with things like indicators. So we're talking about how are adversaries performing their attacks versus something like what is the infrastructure they're using to carry them out. I think in recent times, at least, the main kind of introduction of this TTP concept as a whole is coming from David Bianco's pyramid of pain concept. So this is truly just a mental model. I see this as really one of the foundational kind of mental models for at least cyber threat intelligence, maybe cybersecurity as a whole right now. The specific bands of this pyramid of pain are a little bit arbitrary, but really where I want to kind of draw the cutoff is at least in the top two tiers. So when we're talking about what are traditionally seen as indicators of compromise, that's like the bottom four rungs generally. What the takeaway is here, and we'll elaborate a little bit more on this in a few moments, is these indicators and adversaries' infrastructure, relatively speaking, these are relatively easy for adversaries to change and roll over. Contrast this with their behaviors or their tactics, techniques, and procedures. Again, relatively, generally speaking, these are harder for adversaries to change, and therefore if we can get really good at defending against TTPs, it can be a challenge, but if we get really good, that can actually drive up costs and make it more difficult for many adversaries to operate. What I've often found, again, if you're pretty new to kind of this realm of the cybersecurity world, kind of the classic way, and to make it a little bit stickier, is to use examples from the real world to kind of, again, further explain this difference between something like indicators, infrastructure, versus behaviors. The classic example you usually hear described is like a bank heist. I like to kind of bring it a little bit more into recent times. So I want to contrast, again, indicators with behaviors. If we're talking about something like in the physical security space, indicators could be something like the clothing that you're choosing to wear, or maybe the paint job on your car, or your frosted tips, or maybe the type of beverage that you like to drink after you've performed a successful heist. Contrast this with the behaviors. So what are the specific movements and operations that you use to carry out your attack or your heist? What are the driving techniques that you use to evade police or actually get onto the cargo truck in this example? Or how do you celebrate afterwards? It's not about the drink that you're drinking, but maybe how you're drinking it and who you're drinking it with. This is just trying to give a real-world demonstration of kind of the differences here. If it's not immediately obvious, again, probably belaboring this point, but the indicators in this example are much easier for you to change. So you can just swap out your clothing. You could go get a new paint job on your car. You could go start drinking different types of beverages. Contrast that with, to learn how to perform a maneuver like that, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a completely different operating picture if you want to change your behaviors. So just trying to bring some real-world examples to this. But now let's start to shift into the cyber world. So I know this is very small text, so I'll just kind of talk to it. What you're seeing here is, and this is a fantastic resource, again, especially when I share this out, you'll have like the URL to this. But what this is a cybersecurity researcher continually updates prominent indicators of compromise associated with certain major malware families. In this case, it's dealing with Raccoon Stealer. This is a major, very currently active information and credential stealing malware. What you're seeing here, and again, I know it's even small for me to read, but what you're seeing is a list of literally thousands of lines of indicators of compromise associated with, in this case, Raccoon Stealer. This resource, this repo, is continually updated, I think on a daily basis, if not a weekly basis, and this list just keeps on growing. But what you're seeing here are things like the IP addresses associated with the command and control servers associated with Raccoon Stealer, some of the domains that they've set up to host those as well, maybe some phishing pages, kind of representative examples. But at the end of the day, this is a very long and continually growing list of indicators, because the operators and adversaries behind a threat like this can just go up and very easily and quickly stand up a new C2 server. That would change the IP address that is currently serving up Raccoon Stealer malware. They could create a new phishing page almost instantaneously. It's very easy to do. So now to contrast with some of the behaviors or TTPs associated with this exact same threat, I've pulled some snippets from a fantastic report from the Sequoia.io threat research team looking at Raccoon Stealers. So these are some of the specific behaviors associated with this threat. One thing you're going to notice is these sentences obviously include verbs. So how is the threat itself behaving? Raccoon Stealer uses HTTP for C2 communications. That's a little bit different than, of course, the IP address or the domain associated with that C2. It lists files and directories to grab files through all the disks. It harvests cookies from popular browsers, and it exfiltrates data over the C2 channel. Again, for those who may not be as exposed to the TTP angle, or especially this kind of the difference between TTPs and behaviors, just trying to further draw those distinctions. And we will definitely circle back to this and spend a bit more time, but these TTPs can be actually classified, and they are classified using specific unique identifiers. So what you're seeing here are the MITRE ATT&CK identifiers associated with these specific TTPs. Each of these has their own name and definition behind them, and in this case, I'm very familiar with reports like this, and so I kind of intuitively know that this is what's associated with them. We can talk through a little bit more about how to kind of extract these from a CTI report as well, but I just want to highlight kind of the mappings here to something like the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. Cool, so when we talk about different approaches to defense between indicators versus TTPs, when possible to defend against behaviors, you are ultimately going to have kind of better return on investment because you are imposing costs is kind of the jargon we like to use to talk about defending, especially against TTPs. It's forcing the adversary to go back to the drawing board and come up with completely new behaviors, attack approaches, things along those lines, as opposed to just simply, for example, again, rolling over a command and control server, for example. So this can be very challenging for a number of reasons. I think we'll dig in a little bit deeper later in the presentation. But for example, being able to recognize what is an actual malicious behavior versus benign activity, that can be very tough to do in a lot of cases. So I'm not saying this is easy by any means, but when we are successful at defending against TTPs, ultimately it's going to impose more costs on the adversary, make them go back to the drawing board, maybe go after other targets, maybe have to spend some time developing these new TTPs to come back at us again. It's always going to be a cat and mouse game, but that's kind of the approach we at least like to advocate. So when we talk about trying to keep track of TTPs, I talked about in that example where there were hundreds of lines, and if you looked at a few other malware or other threats, you would ultimately end up with a list of literally thousands of indicators of compromise. How do we kind of try to track something like behaviors? I would say almost inarguably the kind of industry standard, if it exists right now, is the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. I've already touched a little bit, but essentially this is a knowledge base, a repository for classifying adversary behaviors. Each of the kind of boxes in here, and I know this one's really small, I just want to kind of show a wide view of the snapshot. I've got a little bit of a drill down so you can see. So I mentioned there is a unique, discrete identifier, kind of called a T code, T followed by a series of numbers associated with each of these defined behaviors. There are a few different levels or layers of abstraction in MITRE ATT&CK. You have kind of at the top the tactic, these are the goals and objectives that adversaries are trying to achieve, and then you have the very specific ways that they carry out those attacks and try to achieve those objectives. Those are known as techniques and sub-techniques in MITRE ATT&CK's terminology. And then kind of the most just specific and granular layer in MITRE ATT&CK is the P in TTP procedures. So ultimately what this is it's just a standardized way of kind of tracking adversary behaviors. There's currently just over 600 discrete techniques and sub-techniques in MITRE ATT&CK. That is just one level of abstraction. You can oftentimes always go layers deeper, but that's kind of the defined scope for it. But if it's not immediately obvious, we're talking in this case of about 600 discrete behaviors, as opposed to a continually growing list of literally thousands of indicators of compromise. I know it's a little bit apples and oranges, but again, I'm just really trying to hammer home this, the difference in scope. When you focus on something like behaviors, you have a much narrower range of things to potentially consider. Again, keeping in mind that you can always go levels deeper and go more granular with it. Just speaking a little bit more still generally about MITRE ATT&CK, what are some of the applications and use cases for it? I think the most powerful application is by having this standardized system for referencing back to adversary behaviors, you can map lots of different things and speak all that same language. So if you work in a large organization, that gives you a common kind of, again, framework or knowledge base to refer back to. So even if you're working with different teams, you can all be talking about the same thing. The same kind of concept applies to the cybersecurity landscape generally, because people who are writing and publishing cyber threat intelligence reports can track in those reports which MITRE ATT&CK TTPs were being used. It's often included like in a table at the bottom of the report. We can also talk about our defensive capabilities and how those map to and defend against certain adversary behaviors. And all those can point back to the same techniques, the technique identifiers. It's just a much more kind of streamlined and consistently referenceable approach to all talking about the same thing. So I've just got a quick snapshot of this up here right now. I'll highlight just a couple snapshots as we go along. Tidal does maintain a community edition of its platform. It is entirely freely available to use. Everything I'm going to show here, you don't even need like a login to register. But I'm not going to hammer it home. I just want to highlight this. This is where the screenshot is coming from in this case. But in this case, we have a lot of like defensive as well as offensive security tooling that map to specific MITRE ATT&CK techniques. So you can do that pivoting, for example, from a CTI report, figure out what analytics you might be able to use to defend against a given technique, what atomic red team unit tests could you run to kind of simulate that technique as well. I kind of just wanted to throw this in here finally. I know we're shifting gears a little bit. This is also pretty small, but this is just looking at kind of the rate of growth for shifting gears slightly to something like vulnerabilities. So CVEs, another common way of referencing back to the same things. You have a CVE identifier. The number of CVEs that are being published year over year just continues to grow at a pretty sharp rate. We can contrast this with the growth of the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. And again, apples and oranges, certainly. But the point here is that the growth of MITRE ATT&CK, it continues to grow and expand as well, but it's much more steady and slow growth. Generally, we're only recognizing a handful of new techniques in a given quarter or a couple times per year, as opposed to just the dramatic scale of something like CVE growth as well. I know we're speaking a little bit different perspectives, but much narrower range of things to potentially think about and worry about when we look at TTPs. All right, again, please feel free to jump in if any folks have questions just as we go along. I'm going to get into kind of the second major part of our conversation today, which is I think what most people are here to speak about, which are some specific recent examples of TTP evolution. All right, so put very simply, how are we defining this? Nothing really special with this definition here, just referring to efforts for cyber adversaries to change, modify, or adapt their behaviors, or TTPs. What we've noticed when we look at the threat landscape as a whole is that, and we don't have some perfectly consistent metrics, unfortunately, to really refer back to, but hopefully with some of the clear examples that I'll be demonstrating, you can see why we're coming to this conclusion. Ultimately, we believe that the pace of TTP evolution is increasing at the end of the day. So traditionally, and as we've been talking about here, we've been advocating for kind of focus on behaviors because it's that narrower range of things to potentially think about as opposed to indicators. Please do not get me wrong, defense in depth is extremely important. You need to be also considering indicators as part of your defensive approach. I think generally that's an area that can relatively be automated. We're dealing much more with kind of structured text, so IP addresses, domains, things along those lines. Certainly different levels of nuance to that as well, but that approach can generally be more automated as opposed to really having to dig in and fine-tune for behavior-based defense. So that's just why this is especially notable for a defender standpoint, because we need to be thinking about how TTPs and behaviors are also changing, even if they might not change quite as fast as something like a C2 IP address. One of the positive takeaways from this overall assessment, because I do think it is a little bit gloomy, we're saying, now we need to be worrying about TTPs changing often as well. One of the positive things is that oftentimes we're seeing TTPs change as a result of improvements and changes that we are putting into place as defenders. So oftentimes, we're seeing success, and I'll point out a few specific examples here, but we're also seeing adversaries being able to pretty quickly kind of accommodate and adjust to those defensive changes as well. So truly that kind of constant cat and mouse game, but hopefully we can, keep, truly that's about all we can do is just keep kind of modifying our defenses as well in response to the latest changes. So this graphic is trying to kind of visualize basically that last point that I just touched on, and especially kind of the economics of TTP evolution. I would say probably most often we're seeing TTP evolution happening as a result of those defensive changes. That's not the only reason it happens, though, certainly. I called the vertical axis here relative adversary profit margin. Essentially what we can see here is if adversaries potentially just on their own identify some other opportunities to have better return on investment themselves. I think this is easiest to think about when we talk about e-crime and crimeware. If adversaries identify some other way to ultimately just make more money, I think it makes a lot of logical sense that they're going to shift over. But that means that their existing modus operandi is no longer as profitable as what they might move towards. So that's why the relative margin is going down in this case. So what we see when this happens is at least the potential for the adversary to consider other attack methods is going to increase. This is mostly I'm just trying to kind of lay out my own mental process as I kind of think through some of this. So this may be a little bit obvious, but I do think it's actually a helpful visual to kind of think about these shifts and what's happening. So I want to move now into some of the specific examples, and we're going to call this first one kind of very generally looking at initial access brokers. This example, the specific case that we're going to start with is a malware known as Cacbot. Ultimately, what these initial access malware are designed to do, if it's not obvious, is they are really good at gaining that initial foothold into a victim environment, and then oftentimes other more impactful malware, probably most notably recently ransomware, is ultimately then delivered or ingressed into the operating environment for like maximum impact ultimately. These initial access threats and malware specifically are amongst the ones that are most adept at evolving their TTPs. It really is kind of almost unbelievable how quickly, and Cacbot is kind of the standout example here, how quickly Cacbot's operators are able to adjust the methods that they use to gain those initial infections to consistently just keep performing this activity. And this has been going on for many, many years. What I want to highlight in the graphic is going back now at this point, over a year and a half, back to September 2021, which is when the current and continuing wave of Cacbot infections really kind of picked back up. This malware is kind of known for oftentimes going into periods, including lengthy periods of inactivity. But in September 2021, we saw an uptick of Cacbot infections once again. The way that those were typically being carried out is heavy use of Excel email attachments with malicious macros built in. So I think probably a lot of folks have at least heard about that macro-based attack vector, which was really common when we saw this attack wave pick back up. What we saw in pretty quick response, because this was a very kind of high-level campaign that Cacbot operators started to carry out, what we saw was a very positive development. I think most of us would agree, potentially a little bit overdue, but I'm very glad to see it finally happen. So in February of 2022, we saw Microsoft begin default blocking of files that were downloaded from the internet via a feature. It's a little bit of technical jargon. It's called Mark of the Web. It's essentially flagging those files as coming from the internet because this was such a known popular attack infection vector. So we saw that defensive change. They started by default blocking the macro-enabled documents, and so almost immediately, I think it was a time span of maybe like a month, a few weeks, we saw Cacbot shifting to other initial infection mechanisms. So I've got a few of those highlighted. I won't go into the full details. Happy to chat more afterwards. You can read a lot of deep dive reporting on this, but essentially using some complex kind of infection chains, different types of file types being used that maybe didn't have as much scrutiny on them as some other ones. But ultimately what this allowed Cacbot operators to do was to bypass this new Mark of the Web security safeguard and continue successfully infecting victims. So what we saw then, the cat and mouse game continues. In November of 2022, once again, we saw new Mark of the Web safeguards being released by Microsoft, essentially taking a slightly different approach to just kind of enhance that capability. Almost immediately, and this was even faster than the previous example I mentioned, some threat actors discovered what was kind of known as a zero-day exploit to entirely work around this Mark of the Web feature. It almost rendered it inoperable in some cases. So what we saw then is on top of that, some additional file types being used. Probably some folks have heard of this current OneNote campaign. It's a specific Microsoft file type that was being used for Cacbot deliveries then as well. So that was, the 0 day was not heavily observed, used in the wild, but what we saw is kind of this shift to the one-note files, which were a little bit successful in bypassing the latest safeguards here. So if it's not apparent, constantly shifting behaviors to perform these infection chains, and this is all kind of setting aside, again, the extremely long list of IPs associated with the Cacbot C2s, not a super common phishing vector, mostly through, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought, but ultimately it's a very evolving threat here with Cacbot. So I mentioned that that's probably one of the most notable cases of an evolving threat, but this is not the only one, even when we're dealing with these initial access malware specifically. Another one that's been very adept at evolving its TTPs over time is a threat called heist ID. This is another one used to gain that initial foothold and deliver a variety of other types of threats. Ransomware is very commonly associated with this one as well. What we saw here, and you can see this pretty clearly, so this is a nice MITRE ATT&CK kind of matrix view where you're seeing in the different colors. I know this is also pretty small, but you're seeing the different phases of heist ID techniques now specifically over different periods of time. And what you'll definitely notice is that certain of these TTPs or behaviors are being used across those different time spans, which is not uncommon for even certain evolving threats. But then we look at certain other techniques. So maybe some of the second stage techniques. Once the initial infection has successfully landed, what techniques are the adversaries using to move around within the network or to discover some of those files that they might want to exfiltrate? Some of those changed in association with heist ID, depending on which kind of campaign time period you wanted to take a look at. So for those folks who haven't utilized the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base, and especially these matrix views, this is a very good use case for kind of visualizing this cyber threat intelligence. It's hopefully pretty easy to see where certain techniques are kind of overlapping, being used, in this case, across different time periods, as well as to identify ones that are kind of newer or maybe net new in some cases. I wanted to finally highlight, so I know this is real small, just to get a sense of kind of the overall landscape. This is a deep dive study. We wrote a blog and produced a public webinar around this as well, looking at kind of this initial access and malware delivery landscape kind of as a whole, and looking at all the various connections which themselves oftentimes shift amongst different groups as well. So ultimately, kind of the driver behind some of these changes is quite honestly the criminal ecosystem itself. Different incentives for whoever's the highest bidder of the week, of the month, of the quarter. That's who you're going to want to work with to ultimately deliver, whatever threat they're providing. So a lot of these initial access operator groups are extremely motivated by the highest bidder, and they're extremely adept at getting that initial foothold. But they'll basically hand over then that access to any number of different types of operators, and it's ultimately just going to be motivated by money at the end of the day. All right, so we're going to shift gears to our second example of TTP evolution, and this case is going to focus on ransomware. This is a little bit less exclusive to a very specific group. We've seen quite a handful, really, at this point, starting to display some of these changes, and I think this is absolutely, almost undoubtedly, kind of a growing trend, and I'll point to a few specific examples of this. But essentially what we're seeing is, I think most traditionally, what you associate with ransomware is encryption of victim files. So locking those files down, demanding the ransom, and then handing over a decryption key to unlock them and give access back. What we're starting to see in quite a few cases is some groups actually moving away from that typically classically associated encryption schemes. So what they're doing instead is, in some cases in tandem, they are oftentimes focusing on exfiltrating data and then threatening to leak it, essentially. And that's where the pressure is applied to pay up the ransom to the victim. What I think is really interesting is we've started to see some groups entirely focusing on that model of extortion. So wouldn't even call them ransomware traditionally because they're not actually encrypting any victim files. They're just focused on pulling data out and then threatening to leak it and applying the pressure in that way. I've highlighted a few of those kind of in the middle of the slide here. So groups like Lapsus, Karakurt, Ransom House, I think is entirely motivated by that kind of approach, and then a few kind of smaller ones. So some mixtures here. But we can already talk about what some of the drivers are behind this specific example of TTP evolution. Oftentimes, it's an emphasis on the speed of the attack. It ultimately, even though a lot of ransomware encryption has gotten extremely fast in recent years, in many cases, it's found to be actually ultimately faster to just focus on discovering information and exfiltrating it rather than taking that final step of actually trying to encrypt victim data. There are also some interesting kind of worrying cases as well in order to, again, truly just kind of speed up the operation as a whole. Doing something like intermittent encryption, which can kind of only lock down certain parts of a file, so it's not the entire thing as a whole. That, if it's not obvious, is ultimately faster to do, or in some cases just focusing on outright just destroying the data as well, which would lead to total loss. So that's a pretty concerning example, of course. Let's see. One thing I did want to highlight while we're still on this slide, on the right-hand side, I've highlighted a few of these specific techniques that are falling into some of the tactics or objectives that fall in line with kind of this trend. So we can look at what are the specific communication channels that adversaries are using to exfiltrate this data. If they set up their own C2 and are communicating that way, we're seeing increasingly moves to exfiltrate data to cloud storage solutions. So that provides some actually interesting nuances for defense, because these, of course, could be things that are legitimately used in your environment. So it may be blending into existing network traffic. It may provide some opportunities to outright block some command and control channels as well. So just a few things to quickly think about. On the collection side, this is, of course, so we're talking about adversaries' attempts to kind of gather and collate and aggregate some of the data that they ultimately want to move out of the environment. That, of course, is going to give you an opportunity to potentially detect that activity before it actually moves out. Oftentimes, this can be extremely noisy behavior if you're looking at all events that are happening, because these are going to be legitimate events and activities that are happening on your network. So it's a very common and kind of classic trade-off oftentimes when we're looking at behavior-focused defense, kind of the trade-off between noise and fidelity of the detection, but hopefully trying to move a little bit earlier in the attack chain. So definitely can be a challenge for sure. Cool. So I just want to highlight this as kind of a, don't take our word for it. What you're seeing here is a snapshot of a recent US CISA report focusing on one still called traditionally a ransomware group. In this case, I believe it was US authorities are still seeing a mixture of more typical encryption type activity associated with this group, as well as kind of that exfiltration focus and the extortion from there. This was a jointly produced report with Australian authorities, and I may have them flipped, it doesn't really matter, but in one of the cases they've seen every incident that they've investigated has only involved exfiltration of the data and no actual encryption or locking in the files. So this is a pretty well-known group. It's carried out a lot of attacks over the past year and a half alone. So I think it is interesting to see something this prominent moving towards kind of that entirely encryption-focused approach. And this is exactly the same type of matrix I highlighted previously. I got two snapshots in time of Lian's techniques, just purely based on public reporting. And I know it's really small, but you can see some examples where some of those techniques are staying consistent, but some cases where we're seeing net new ones. And those would be things like those exfiltration techniques that I highlighted before. I have links back, by the way, to all of these. Again, entirely publicly available on our community edition, so I know everyone's squinting to see this, but you can dig into a lot more detail that way. All right, and then third and final example, this one's going to be a little bit faster, but we've been having a ton of focus recently on info stealers, so information and credential stealing malware. We're especially focused here. Many of these info stealers are not currently tracked in the formal MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base, and so we've had a lot of requests from the community and from our clients to kind of aggregate TTPs associated with these types of threats. And so we've done a lot of deep dive studies, and with that, we've noticed some kind of interesting trends in the TTPs associated with these types of threats. What we're ultimately noticing in this case is just kind of increasing capabilities and sophistication. I know that's a big word, but ultimately these malware just becoming more capable at the end of the day. More features and functionality being built into them to allow them to just do more types of things, and especially to target and steal more types of data. So in the kind of very beginning, stealers were especially focused on stealing financial data. What we've seen for a few years now is especially focused on stealing usernames and passwords associated with victims. And most recently, a lot of focus on things like multi-factor authentication tokens and cookies as well. So ultimately, what this allows the adversaries to do is to evade, as we see more 2FA and MFA coming into place, kind of getting around those security measures as well. So this is another great example of going back to, as we do see some security improvements happening across the landscape, naturally, we see adversaries trying to find ways to kind of get around that. One of the other very specific things we've seen with info stealers, which really was not super present previously, it was kind of like if you had the initial infection, you would just try to run the stealer and kind of hope that everything worked and it didn't get caught. These are very much typically spray and pray type operations, so you just try to get as many infections as you can. What we're seeing built into a lot of the most recently discovered info stealers specifically is defense evasion capabilities. So doing things like the way the malware is loaded in kind of a stealthy way that might be a little bit harder for at least traditional antivirus or maybe even EDR to actually detect it, maybe being implanted in certain file locations that may have a little bit less scrutiny or maybe blend in with commonly used file systems. Those are just some of the specific capabilities, techniques, behaviors that we're seeing kind of built into some of the most recent info stealer families. Shifting gears just a little bit, but staying with info stealers, just due to time, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but looking at some of, going back to the initial infection vectors associated with these threats, one of kind of the probably across the board, one of the most rising TTPs that we've seen used recently is, most folks will probably laugh because it's been around for a long time, but malvertising at the end of the day. So abusing legitimate, oftentimes web search ads, just buying those ads and having them route to an adversary-controlled site. We've seen a huge uptick in deliveries through that mechanism for info stealers specifically, but actually lots of other types of malware as well. This is probably the top infection vector for these types of threats, maybe even surpassing phishing in recent times. All right, so I want to shift gears. I'll try to provide a few, hopefully pretty concrete defensive recommendations, but just to kind of kick this off for the scope of the presentation, I want to focus on using this idea of intelligence around TTPs to kind of help improve and prioritize what you might even start to look at. So this is the exact same graphic I had before. We see as, even as a result of security improvements, defensive measures changing, we see an increased appetite or potential for adversaries to modify their TTPs. Kind of the corollary with this is, as we see TTPs changing and evolving, in many cases at an extremely fast pace, we need more threat intelligence around that to kind of keep track of everything that's going on. One of the things that I'm most excited about, and I will talk to this graphic because I know this has a lot going on, but ultimately what you're seeing here in the darkest colors, so the darker blue and the red, is the growth in MITRE ATT&CK mapped CTI reporting. And what we look at Tidal mainly is actually just open source reporting. I do a lot of very broad scale and automated collection of open source reports, and specifically look for ones that have those MITRE ATT&CK identifiers contained within them. And this is certainly just going to be a snapshot of the landscape. No one can see everything that's happening, but what we can see in the background is kind of, they're on different scales of course, but kind of, let's call it all CTI reports in the public domain. It's just going to be a sampling, but I use some consistent metrics to kind of track this. We look at relatively, we're seeing a lot more of these reports coming out with MITRE ATT&CK mappings. We didn't have a ton of time to go into full use case and applications for MITRE ATT&CK, but hopefully it's becoming clear some of the ways that can be put to use. So if more reports are coming out with those MITRE ATT&CK techniques and TTPs associated with them, that's just going to be a benefit to the community. You can start to do more of that pivoting into relevant defensive measures, testing and simulation, all of that kind of stuff. The MITRE ATT&CKs identifiers become kind of the central pivot point there. So I'm super excited about this. At the end of the day, if we want to see more TTP intelligence, this is really going to be kind of one of our starting points as we see more reporting coming out. So I want to give just a few specific examples of what this kind of looks like. I'm including this here especially to encourage folks, if you're not doing MITRE ATT&CK reporting as part of your own program, maybe at least consider it and give you a few examples. So some ways we see this is, of course, kind of the classic MITRE ATT&CK matrix view. So I saw this included at the bottom of a report. This was from Cyber Reason's threat research team. That's pretty cool, nice visual layout. I especially like the table views. So this is US Health and Human Services, their cybersecurity division. They produce some excellent alerting that's publicly available as well. They'll often include a quick table with at least the MITRE ATT&CK identifiers contained within them, those T codes. What I get most excited about is a view like this. What this is including is the tactic level, so what is the actual objective that the technique is being used for? What is that technique identifier? Maybe the human readable name. No one knows all the technique identifiers necessarily and what they relate to, as well as the most granular level of detail here. This is getting closer to that P and TTP, the procedure. How specifically was the technique used? If you're not familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, I know I mentioned it earlier, but there are different levels of abstraction. They are useful for different use cases. I find a ton of value in looking at intelligence and reporting that even maps to the MITRE ATT&CK technique level, but to get to the most granular level, especially, and this is essential if you're trying to write accurate detections or adversary simulations or emulations, you need to know the specific way the technique was used. So things like command lines, what processes were being used, what was the parent-child process, things along those lines. That is labor intensive to try to identify all of that. We're seeing more automation, sometimes sandbox reports, seeing some like natural language processing based extraction of things like procedures from reports, but ultimately it takes a lot of processing to get down to that level. But I am starting to see actually more of it in the community. So this last one is actually a screenshot from CISA's report about BN ransomware group. I was extremely encouraged and excited to see a table like this included. They also had the classic MITRE ATT&CK table like this one. At the bottom, they included an appendix which had the specific commands that were used by this group in all of the incidents that they had investigated. This is where we get to the level where we can accurately say, if I've written an analytic or a new detection rule, this is designed to actually recognize this activity, and then you can go out and try to run like a simulation to replicate it within your own operating environment.
Is there a danger if you have that level of granularity that some other, less sophisticated attack organizations like, all right, that's what we do to not that organization force, but one of the other millions of other organizations?
That's a fantastic point. Yeah, the short answer is yes, especially if you're doing public reporting here. If we're dealing with a private closed source reporting, hopefully only the intended channels are getting that visibility. But yeah, with the public reporting, absolutely, there's always a concern that some of these techniques could be observed, how they're being used, and other folks could adopt them. One of my counterpoints is probably going to be that virtually everything in this report has already been out there and it is well known. It's kind of amazing how much these techniques just continue to be reused successfully. I think ultimately my argument is, hopefully it's correct that there's going to be more benefit to the defender community to get more visibility. But yeah, there's certainly a concern that publicizing some of this, other folks could use it. You could probably make the same argument for some of like the, atomic testing libraries and such as well, because a lot of that is open source these days. But yeah, really good question. I definitely want to save some time for questions. I do have a few more slides, but I want to kind of open it up here. I'll actually maybe pause for the moment on this slide. Again, I will be publicizing these, so you don't have to, dig in. These are all hyperlinked. These are my personal favorite, like libraries for interacting with MITRE ATT&CK data. There's some that will actually help you kind of pre-process like a CTI report. All of the visualization tools that I've been highlighting, so displaying the data in a matrix view. There's some excellent and relatively easy, mostly Python-based scripts to help you kind of do all of that. The MITRE Assistant tool is a really cool one. I'm seeing a lot of interest and traction in as well. So yeah, why don't I pause there. If we do have a few minutes at the very end, I can keep going through a couple more slides, but I'll open it up to a few more questions. That was good timing. Yeah. That's a really good question. I honestly don't think I know the answer to that. So you're saying, of course, like the use of AI in attacks, right? I think there's certainly, almost certainly an element of that for sure. I know we have started to see a little bit, at least more interest in that, some technical reporting around it. I don't know if I can necessarily draw a direct correlation there, but I think it makes logical sense for sure. Yeah.
Takes time,
Certainly.
bandwidth between elements.
Yeah, for sure.
Adopting and using AI to understand what's going on and making variants of that, I think is a lot easier.
Yeah, certainly. And also to give you the ability to perform maybe slight variations on those techniques to modify this. So where I thought you were going with your question, because it's a point that I like to really kind of emphasize a lot, is when you start to get to this level, I know it's super small, but if you are only ever focusing on the specific commands that were used in a specific campaign, it starts almost to me to feel like we're moving a little bit back towards an indicator type approach. Certainly you want to defend against what was actively used and known in a campaign, but I always just want to be advocating for, as defenders, also thinking about the art of the possible and thinking what other variations on those techniques. It's going to take being a more mature team, having the resources to be able to run those simulations yourself, but if we know an adversary is using this PowerShell command to perform file discovery, why not go think about some of the 10, 15, 100 other ways you could do that? I would encourage taking that approach because the adversary is almost certainly doing that as well. It's just resource intensive though, so yeah, easier said than done for sure. Cool. Any other questions? If not, this is the last one. I'll make a point and then I'll leave it on the last bit of slide where I had a few specific detection and mitigation resources. So this is a blog series from Tidal. What we've been doing is, I mentioned this, I'm trying to automate as much of this as I possibly can, but do some pretty broad-based collection and processing looking for these public instances of techniques. What we're starting to do is track all of this and look at changes over time. And I actually think it's revealing some pretty interesting insights. We can start to see down to at least the technique level which ones are being referenced in public reporting pretty often and start to look at which ones are kind of coming up on top. So if you're interested in kind of looking at this approach, I would encourage you to go check that out. And I'm about to get cut off, so I'll leave this on the slide. This is some other vendors that have just produced some really amazing reporting looking at these specific cases of TTP evolution. So this is a really good example, just a handful. They provide Sigma analytics, other types of analytics, and just kind of good defensive guidance in general here. So all right, I'll cut it off here. I'll be around for the rest of the conference. Happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thanks so much for coming and for the time.